One by one, the factories shuttered and left our shores, with not even a thought about the millions and millions of American workers that were left behind. But that is the past. And now we are looking only to the future.
There are some strong words from the new president, but will he do it? More importantly, can he do it? Can Donald Trump bring growth and prosperity back to the United States economy in the same way that Ronald Reagan did 30 years ago? Or are conditions just so different this time that the deck is stacked against him? Wall Street has shown a lot of optimism so far about Trump's potential to deliver economic growth, but a lot of economists are skeptical. And even if he does deliver, could there be hidden dangers for the future, for the national debt, or for your portfolio? It's time to tune out all the hype and focus on the facts. Facts that matter to you, the income generation. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Income Generation. I'm David Scranton, your host. Right now, investors are questioning, can Donald Trump really get the U.S. economy moving forward? There's so much at stake these days. There's so many different factors to consider, but don't worry, because we're going to get to the bottom of this important question on this week's show. Can Trump do it? By the numbers. We'll be joined this week by leading economists Art Laffer and Peter Morici. Later, I'll get insights and opinions from some of my fellow financial advisors who may or may not agree about the new president's chances of success. But now let's take a closer look at some of the biggest challenges facing Trump's economic goals. So, what's been going wrong with the economy ever since the Great Recession? Why hasn't it really recovered to a level where we have healthy inflation, rising employment, increasing interest rates, and strong GDP numbers? Well, I personally believe it's because the strategies used by the Obama administration to stimulate the economy were horribly misguided. Essentially, President Obama sat on his hands for 8 years and let the Federal Reserve do all of the heavy lifting. The Fed ran amok with artificial stimulus, first under Chairman Ben Bernanke, and then with current chair Janet Yellen. Through 3 rounds of quantitative easing, or 4 if you count Operation Twist, the Federal Reserve basically tried to spur spending and growth with steady injections of economic steroids. And just like any drug, quantitative easing became increasingly addictive and increasingly less effective over time. Why? Well, to a large extent, we have been the problem. Baby boomers, those of us nearing retirement, have been bitten twice since the year 2000 by major stock market crashes, and once by the collapse of the real estate industry and the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. So naturally, we weren't about to take all this new money artificially pumped into the economy by the Federal Reserve and to spend it on new cars and trips and clothing and things that we simply don't need. No, we used it to pay down our debts and to try to rebuild our retirement savings. This is why the Obama administration's policies only created an asset recovery, not an economic recovery, starting in 2008. Boomers like you and me have been focusing on saving and investing, not spending. And with near zero interest rates driving everyday investors up the risk curve, that's why the stock market has hit new peaks multiple times since the year 2008. However, one could agree it's been artificially inflated this whole time, running on economic steroids in essence instead of economic fundamentals. Unfortunately, this economic reliance on cheap money didn't start with the Obama administration. It's really been going on now for nearly 30 years. In fact, starting in the 1980s, the collective consumer mindset was that you needed new big-ticket items every 3 or 4 years or so. So you bought them. For example, I got my own first mortgage in the 1980s with one of the first liar loans, as they have subsequently become known, which required no proof of income. They were common then, just like it became common to lease a new car every 3 years, whether you needed it or not. The bottom line is we got used to easy money, even though it was never really healthy for our country long term. Yes, it did help drive the economy by creating demand for cars and clothing and houses and all the other new stuff that we needed so frequently. In turn, that created jobs and drove up the housing market and funneled into every sector of the economy. The problem, though, is that it wasn't real demand. It was artificially created demand, fueled by Madison Avenue and greedy CEOs. And even our purchasing power was artificial with things like liar loans, subprime mortgages, and so many other outrageous lending practices. The point now is that after 30 years, we as consumers have learned our lesson, that economic growth based on cheap money doesn't work. I know I've learned it, even if Janet Yellen and the Obama administration didn't. For example, I drive to work every day in Old Faithful, my 9-year-old vehicle. Could I afford to buy a new car every 3 years? Of course I could. But like you, I'm focused on saving, not spending. And this new collective save, don't spend mindset is the reason that this time the bond market has actually risen along with the stock market, right? Usually one zigs and the other zags. It's also the reason why real estate is again on the upswing. In the end, all of this very, very important information leads to the question, can Donald Trump grow the economy? Because our save, don't spend mindset isn't likely to change anytime soon, if ever. Donald Trump has promised to achieve 4% annual economic growth, but this will present a major challenge to that goal. Can he overcome it? Is he bringing enough real strategy to the Oval Office as opposed to artificial strategy to clear this huge hurdle? And what are the possible implications of his success or failure for the stock market, for interest rates, the national debt, and most importantly, for your portfolio? My guest, Peter Morici, is a former chief economist of the U.S. International Trade Commission and a professor at the University of Maryland Smith School of Business. He's widely respected as a columnist, a regular contributor to Fox News, and a frequent guest on all the major networks. He's been named Best Forecaster by MarketWatch 5 times. And we're always fortunate when he's able to find the time to join us here on The Income Generation. Peter, thank you for being a friend of The Income Generation, and welcome back.
Nice to be with you.
You published an article recently on what to expect economically in Trump's first 100 days. Do you mind sharing some of that content with our audience?
Well, we're sure going to see something about health care. They almost have to. Donald Trump, on his first day in office, issued an executive order which directs the federal agencies not to impose any unnecessary financial or administrative burdens on individuals because of the act, including, financial burdens, taxes of any kind, and so forth. What that essentially does is repeals the individual mandate. Very shortly, people won't have to buy health insurance, so they won't have to go on the exchanges. That forces the issue because that's basically going to drive insurance companies off the exchanges. And the Congress will have to come up with an alternative.
Of course, insurance companies are going to be worried about this thing called adverse selection, where it's only the unhealthy people are going to want the medical insurance. So that forces them out of business, and I think people don't understand that. How about...
That's what's happening.
Well, exactly. And that's why that was unfortunately a necessary part of Obamacare in order to get the insurance companies' participation. But how about the economy overall? It's interesting. President Obama was barely able to get 1% growth on GDP, and a lot of that came from, of course, the monetary stimulus. What additional things do you see Trump doing, or what additional things do you think President Trump should be doing in order to get the economy growing?
Well, 1 and 1 equals 2. But in this case, it's 3. If we have deregulation, we will get some push. If we get tax cuts, we'll get some push. But it's the combination of the two that would really create dynamic growth. My feeling is if we deregulate the economy and get the tax reforms and cuts, tax reform, very important word here, get rid of all the very high rates and get rid of all the deductions and exemptions, then we will get businesses making the decisions for the right reasons, not tax reasons, and they'll have an incentive to invest, and it'll be cheaper to invest because the regulatory yoke will have been removed from their neck. In addition, getting trade policy right with China is very important, and that's going to be a process that takes several months or years, but it's important now that we have a president that understands that.
Okay, let's break those down one at a time. Deregulation is simple. That makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense to all of our viewers. But how about the tax cuts? This whole show we're having today is really about the national debt. It's about the deficit, his threats with potentially increasing fiscal spending as well as tax cuts. So what can we do to keep that in check? Exactly how much can he cut taxes and still maintain some semblance of a balanced budget?
Well, he can cut personal taxes modestly. and still have some semblance of a balanced budget, because he would then get some additional growth from people consuming more. But we shouldn't overestimate that. No amount of dynamic scoring is going to make a tax cut equal an unchanged budget deficit. There will be some increase there. He can do more with infrastructure in that regard. It's silly to think that we can pay for most infrastructure with private financing. I mean, should that road in front of your house be a toll road? I mean, should you pay a toll to get out of your house? Of course not. Put a new roof on the school. The only way you can pay for that with private money is to sell the school to a private business, then rent it back. That would raise the implicit rent on the school, and the school district would have to pay more, and you'd have to pay higher taxes. At the end of the day, infrastructure is going to cost money, and you're going to have to pay some fees, gas taxes or what have you, to get it. And finally, we have the corporate tax. Because of the border tax adjustments that the Congress wants to put in place, if we do that, there'll be a net revenue gain of about $100 billion. As a consequence, that can be used to cut corporate taxes overall to about 20%. Again, if we streamline the tax as well, by getting rid of a lot of unnecessary deductions and credits and incentives, and just get people back to picking investments that are the best choices. That's so terribly important because our rates are so much higher than abroad, where they rely on rebatable value-added taxes. So my feeling is that we can do a lot with the corporate tax and not have a negative impact on the budget.
Well, the corporate tax is great because, we've got to stop corporate America from leaving the United States. So that's almost a necessary thing. But how do you cut personal taxes? And I guess you have to hope that people take that additional money they have in their paycheck and they spend it, as opposed to just saving it or paying off debt. So how do you cut personal taxes, increase fiscal spending on roads and infrastructure without the national debt just ballooning out of control?
Welcome to Peter's fiscal mechanics. If we spend $100 billion a year on roads and so forth, with things like gasoline taxes, port fees, and what have you, and we also finance some of that with private money, because there is potential to finance some of that way, then we probably could spend about $80 billion in additional taxes or fees for user fees, and get about $120 billion of additional GDP.
Okay.
Federal government will probably glean out of that $30 billion. We could take that $30 billion over to the personal income tax and use that to lower rates a little bit. It's not a lot, but the most important thing on the personal income tax are things like the carried interest, which permit corporate executives to pay themselves lavishly well,
sure,
and then pay lower rates than the rest of us.
Which, Peter,
if we close that loophole,
Peter,
that provides
we need to take a quick commercial
opportunity.
break right now, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you about the carried interest, because I think a lot of our viewers may not understand what that is. So if you stay with us, we'll be back in just a moment, Peter. And for our viewers, again, we'll be back in a moment with more from famed economist Peter Morici.
Read David J. Scranton's groundbreaking new book, Return on Principle: 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Discover practical solutions to the financial challenges facing today's generation of retirees and near retirees. Learn the truth about Wall Street, the financial media, and the secrets they try to hide from everyday investors. This isn't just another book about investing. Working Americans who have lived through 2 major stock market crashes and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression in the past 16 years don't need another book about investing. David Scranton's approach to financial planning is a holistic system designed for maximum protection, strategic growth, and reliable income regardless of market conditions. Stop planning for retirement with your fingers crossed. Read Return on Principle: 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Available now.
Welcome back. We're here with a good friend of the income generation, Peter Morici. Okay, Peter, so you feel as though the personal tax cuts can be done on a revenue neutral basis. But how about the corporate tax cuts? A lot of critics of that, and I'm not one of them, but they say that, well, that sounds a little bit like trickle-down economics. Tell us, does trickle-down economics work or not?
Basically, because we import more than we export, if we start border adjusting the corporate income tax, that is remitting it on exports and applying it to imports, we pick up $100 billion. That's quite a bit of money in the corporate tax structure, and that would permit us to cut the absolute amount of revenue we receive. In addition, if we got rid of a lot of credits and deductions and special deals and simplified the bloody thing, then we would be able to have lower rates because that would generate revenue as well. Mm-hmm. So I think there are things that we can do, and I think that we can do them very positively.
Yeah, I've always thought,
and I think that would be consistent with the practice.
I've always thought trickle-down economics, for example, makes sense. The biggest problem is, it makes sense because it gets the velocity of money going as opposed to one person buying a product or a service. Maybe if you're lucky, if you're not, they're paying off debt or putting it in the bank, which is what happened why the stock market went crazy, of course, as you know, over the last 8 years or so. But the reason trickle-down hasn't worked is because of the administration changes. I've always believed it hasn't been given enough time for it really to work before something else gets enacted. Your thoughts?
Well, we didn't have corporate tax reform with George W. Bush, so we have to go back to Ronald Reagan to see genuine, tax reform or tax cuts and so forth. He had 4.4% growth over the same period that Barack Obama had 2.1%. So given that contrast in records, it seems to me it works very well.
Sure.
Now, I was on Public Radio International recently, To the Point, a show out of Los Angeles, and they hit me with, look at Kansas. They cut rates there, and the economy's not even doing as well as the national average. Well, how I would counter that? Look at Illinois. Since over the last 4 to 6 years, they've raised state taxes. Rahm Emanuel's been elected a mayor of Chicago, and it's losing population. Its economy's tanking. And if we went there to do a show, we'd have logistic issues in Chicago, tripping over all the bodies.
In 10 seconds or less, if President Trump were to enact your policies, what you're suggesting, what kind of GDP growth rate do you think he can achieve realistically?
On a steady basis, sustainable 3.5%.
And you know what? Right now, we'll take that, will we not?
You betcha. I'd love to have that.
Peter, thanks again. I really appreciate you being on. Again, a great friend of the income generation. We've talked about some of the challenges facing Donald Trump, the main one being a consumer base that wants real strategies, not artificial strategies. The good news is that he's moving very quickly. Trump has put together some deals designed to keep jobs right here in the United States, including deals with Carrier, Ford, and Sprint. That's all encouraging because even by attempting to get these kinds of programs moving, he's already doing more than President Obama ever did by letting Janet Yellen shoulder the load for 8 years. However, even if Trump does create these new jobs and increases domestic production and raise the standard of living, is that really going to result in 4% GDP growth? In other words, even if it is real money this time being pumped into the economy instead of artificial money, are people going to spend again? Or are the majority going to stay locked into this save, don't spend mindset? Now, that mindset is not necessarily bad for you, I want to be very clear, but it doesn't help jumpstart the economy. When people are saving and they have their own financial house in order, yes, it reduces the need for social programs. It gives them more discretionary income. But we're not there yet by a long shot. So, President Trump's challenge is to find a balance between strategies that spur spending, growth, and stability in the present without making gun-shy investors feel like they're jeopardizing their economic future. The Obama administration's policies had no such balance. They were short-sighted efforts that relied on low interest rates and printed money to try to spur spending and also borrowing today at the expense of children and grandchildren 20 or 30 years later. If President Trump can strike this balance between stimulating growth now without asking Americans to sacrifice their economic future, then yes, I think he has a shot at delivering on his promise. Now, let's bring in my next guest, Art Laffer. Art Laffer first gained prominence during the Reagan administration as a member of Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board. He's been called the father of supply-side economics, and he's one of the few people who actually predicted Donald Trump's election win many months in advance. He's the author or co-author of many books, and the creator of the well-known Laffer curve, which illustrates the relationship between tax rates and resulting levels of government revenue. Thanks for being here, Art.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure.
You said before the election that the Reagan saga of 1980 seems a lot like the Trump story today. Does that apply from an economic standpoint?
It does. It really does. I mean, they're obviously not exactly the same by any means, and they're very different characters, but they both are outsiders, both coming to it with a notion of creating private sector growth and shrinking government and lowering tax rates and deregulating the economy and having sound money. And, you know, other than that, there's nothing much left else to do.
You know, shrinking tax rates, let's talk about that a little bit. You know, Ronald Reagan, of course, lowered tax rates down to that 28% bracket with a little 33% bubble they had for a while. And that seemed to work for him. The question is, with the national debt at the levels it is today, can that kind of strategy work for Donald Trump in today's environment?
I think it can work very well. But let me just say, without economic growth, you are not going to get any solutions to the national debt problem, period. And without tax reform and tax reductions, you will not get the economic growth you really need and want. So when you look at it, tax reform and incentives in place are the sine qua non of economic growth, which is the only path to prosperity and to solving these things like the debt problem. Now, if I can, on the debt issue by itself, Ronald Reagan did not reduce the U.S. national debt, as everyone knows. But the things they don't realize is that debt is an intermediate product. What we had during the 1980s is a huge, huge increase in wealth that way overwhelmed any increase in the national debt. What we had is a huge increase in economic growth in the U.S., which increased output, employment, and production, which is really the reason why government exists, is to create that prosperity for the economy. So I would argue that under Reagan, the national debt did go up. That's very true. But frankly, it was well worth the increase in the national debt to create the increase in wealth and prosperity we had.
Now, our viewers are probably thinking back to 2008 in real estate and saying, well, that's like the same argument that, you know, I can keep borrowing from my home as long as the value of the home comes up. I still have equity left. And that's the same argument with the government. But then we saw what happens when all of a sudden there's a blip on the radar screen and things don't work out so well. Everything flips upside down. How does that work with the government?
When you have a lot of debt. You know, that happens when you have a lot of debt. I mean, I'd much prefer to have much less debt than we currently have. But, you know, I can't change W and Obama's policies and going back many, many years when they've increased that debt dramatically.
So what happens, though, if today we have a bubble of the population, the baby boomers has gotten a little bit older, maybe they're getting closer to retirement, they have additional spendable wealth because of a lower tax rate, but they decide that instead of spending it, especially with something similar to a VAT tax, they say, well, we're not going to spend it. We're going to pay off our debt. We're going to save for retirement because that's what we really need to do. Then that can work against us, could it not?
No, it won't work against us, no. I mean, GDP and total net spending are the same. What I've done with that tax of a personal unadjusted income tax and a net sales tax is that's two aspects of GDP. One is when it's spent and one is when it's earned. It's a double entry accounting system, and that will give you something close to 21% of GDP in collected in federal taxes. I mean, that's what it'll give you. It'll lower those marginal rates to 12%. You would create a monster of economic growth with enormous Laffer curve effects that will clearly solve a lot of your debt problems, a lot of your unemployment problems, a lot of your poverty problems, and we would come back to being great again. Did I say that correctly? We could make America great again. I'm just joking.
You said it correctly. I love it. That's perfect.
I do like it. It was Morning in America when we did it, but we came very close. By the way, we reduced the personal income tax rate to 28%.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump could do that too. Now, remember, it took us 6 years to get to the 28%. So don't ask too much of Trump in the first hour.
28% wouldn't be terrible right now by today's standards. So listen, we need to take a quick commercial break. Stay with us, Art. We'll be right back. And for our viewers, our Income Generation members, you stay with us also. We have many more words of wisdom from Art Laffer. We'll be right back. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation, again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. Welcome back. We're here with renowned economist Art Laffer. Art, right before the break, you'd said that with your program that you're prescribing, we could potentially have revenues to the government 21% of GDP. Let me ask you, what are the revenues today under today's current tax plan as a percentage
They're a little
of
under
GDP?
20%, but the long run number, properly at full employment, economic growth, and all that stuff, is about 20% of GDP. That's where government taxes should be, where government spending should be, plus or minus a little bit in there, depending on the cycle, stage, and whatever. But a 20% tax revenues as a share of GDP is sort of the goal and the target for good federal policy.
So now, what do you think about all the fiscal stimulus that Trump is talking about, the infrastructure and things like that? That could serve to actually increase the national debt, increase the deficit, et cetera, et cetera. So does that 21% still cover it based upon those programs? And what do you think about those fiscal programs?
Well, what you really want to do is make sure you have the long run revenues taken care of. And you can't have long run tax revenues without economic growth. You just can't do it. So therefore, we have to create the economic growth. And part of the issue here is, you know, in the short run, let's say the next 2-3 years, increasing economic growth may result in higher national debt and higher deficits. It may, if it includes infrastructure. Now, if it's infrastructure stimulus spending, the way Obama and W did it, it absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. Governments don't create resources, they redistribute resources. And whenever they bail someone out of trouble, they put someone else into trouble. Milton Friedman said it perfectly when he said that government spending is taxation. Now, there are certain functions government should do and does do, and they should do it well. Infrastructure is one of those areas. So if the infrastructure spending that Trump is promising and is looking toward, if it's really pro-growth, efficient infrastructure, it could be a wonderful expenditure that would lead to much higher economic growth in the future. I'm hoping that's what he is proposing, but I haven't seen the specifics of these proposals. And even if I did, I'm not sure I'd be able to understand them well enough to know whether really the pro-growth.
Give us an example, Art, if you will, of what you think would be a good pro-growth expenditure, fiscal spending, versus one that you think is a negative expenditure.
Well, transfer payments, welfare. If you tax people who work and you pay people who don't work, do I need to say the next sentence to you?
No, okay.
Don't be surprised if you find a lot of people not working. That is a bad expenditure from the standpoint of economic growth. You need to have it when you have poverty and despair, but you want to limit that, and you want to make sure that welfare spending doesn't create the very poverty that you're trying to cure by destroying economic growth.
Sure.
Now, if you look at highways, you look at some of the data structures, you look at some of the patents, you look at national defense, you look at education. Some of these programs may well enhance economic growth going forward, and they're the ones you should focus on, not on the ones that are subsidies and bailouts and paying people not to work.
I know you talked about the importance of lowering and even flattening personal income taxes, but how about corporate tax? How important, in your opinion, is corporate tax reform, not just to keeping corporate America here in the United States, but to the economy overall?
Yeah, well, let me just say that the U.S. corporate tax, which is on profits, is the highest in the OECD, and we've got the fourth lowest revenues of all countries in the OECD, some 34 or 35 countries. There's a curve that relates high tax rates to low revenues. And the U.S. is trying to keep businesses in by punishing them if they lose, if they leave. And that's not what's good policy. If we could lower that corporate tax rate to 15%, that would put us about the fourth or fifth lowest of the OECD. Believe me when I tell you the revenues would pour in. Not only would they pour in corporate taxes, but they pour in on secondary, tertiary, and quadrutiary taxes like payroll taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, income taxes. All of those would come in as well and be a boon there, but it would create jobs, output, employment. And again, if I can just talk to you on a global scale, if you have two locations, A and B, if you raise taxes in B and you lower them in A, producers and manufacturers are going to move from
B to A, sure. Of course,
we have lost business globally dramatically through inversions because our tax rate is the highest in the OECD.
So let me ask you
we
this
should
then.
have a very low corporate tax rate.
Let me ask you this, Art. Critics would say that, this is trickle down, and trickle down doesn't work. Now, you saw trickle down firsthand. Why do people say trickle down doesn't work?
Because they don't look at the facts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's as simple as that. It worked very well under Jack Kennedy when he cut the highest rates dramatically. It worked under Reagan. It worked under Harding and Coolidge. It worked under Bill Clinton. I mean, it's been great. It's been done, and it works. Do you think it worked really well under Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter? That's when they did the opposite of my policies.
Right.
Do you think it worked under W and Obama when they did the opposite of my policies? I mean, if you look at this, it's simple. It's straightforward. Economics is all about incentives. And when you make work rewarding and you make non-work unrewarding, people will work more and they'll produce more and the economy will be a lot better. And Jack Kennedy put it perfectly, and if I can,
Sure.
the best form of welfare is still a good high-paying job. The most immoral act a government can ever perpetrate on its citizenry is to enact policies that have the effect of destroying the production base from whence all benefits flow. You gotta protect the mother base of economic production, otherwise it all goes away.
One quick question.
Okay. Yes, sir.
With the tax levels you're talking about, the tax system that you're discussing, what kind of GDP growth rate on a percentage basis can we get with those? Best opinion,
Well, let
best
me just
guess.
say in the 18 months following Reagan's tax cut taking effect, January 1st, 1983, we had an average annual growth rate in real terms of 8%.
You think that's doable today?
Sure. Obama is clearly worse than Carter.
And we'll be.
You know, Trump has a low bar and he has a runway. He can go for 4 years without political worry.
And
it should be a slam dunk for Obama.
Let's face it.
Trump.
Any of our income generation viewers would be happy with half that 4%. So, Art, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I appreciate your words of wisdom. Thank you. Now it's time for another Financial Advisor Roundtable. Please welcome this week's advisors. First, Mark Falter of Mid-American Tax Advisory Group in Kansas City, Missouri. Mark is specialized in working with retirees for 20 of his 30 years as an advisor. He hosts a weekly radio show and has appeared on Fox Business. Although you'd never know it by his youthful appearance, Michael Eastham has 25 years of professional experience under his belt. He's founder of Fellowship Financial Group in Altamont Springs, Florida. Michael actually has a new book coming soon called Common Sense Income Strategies. Last but certainly not least, we have Anthony Siccaro from the Left Coast. He's founder and president of Providence Financial and Insurance Services in Woodland Hills, California. He was twice named one of California's financial leaders by Forbes magazine, and he's a frequent guest on Fox Business and CNBC. Gentlemen, we're talking today about Donald Trump. Can he do it? Michael, let me go to you first. Can he do it?
Well, Dave, I'm in the yes camp, but I have one caveat, and that is $20 trillion of debt. Nobody's really talking about how to deal with that.
Okay, yes for you. Mark, from the middle of the country, from the heartland, your answer?
I believe he can. I think there's a little bit of uncertainty out there. We really don't have a lot of track record on political issues. I believe he can.
Okay. Anthony, last but not least, you're from the left coast, so I'm sure you must have somewhat of a different view here. Tell us your thoughts.
I almost wish I did have a different view, but I actually think he's going to do it. I think there's going to be a lot of pain while he does it. I think it's going to be one of those situations of one step back and 2 steps forward.
That's why I have so much respect for all of you guys. Okay, stay with us. We'll be right back with more from our financial advisor panel. Be right back.
The closing numbers on the markets today. At one point, the market fell as if down a well, over 700 points.
Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%.
Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%. The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Finally, there is an alternative. Read David J. Scranton's groundbreaking new book, Return on Principle, 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Discover practical solutions to the financial challenges facing today's generation of retirees and near retirees. Learn the truth about Wall Street, the financial media, and the secrets they try to hide from everyday investors. This isn't just another book about investing. Working Americans who have lived through 2 major stock market crashes and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression in the past 16 years don't need another book about investing. David Scranton's approach to financial planning is a holistic system designed for maximum protection, strategic growth, and reliable income regardless of market conditions. Stop planning for retirement with your fingers crossed. Plan with confidence, knowledge, and peace of mind. Read Return on Principle, 7 core values to help protect your money in good times and bad. Available now.
So now let's continue this week's conversation and welcome back Mark Falter, Michael Eastham, and Anthony Siccaro. Gentlemen, we all seem to be optimistic, very hopeful, maybe even a little bit confident that Donald Trump can pull this off. So let's go through the menu that he's serving up one item at a time, and let's start with fiscal spending. Michael, how do you think the fiscal spending is going to affect our country, the good, the bad, and the ugly?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest concerns that I have over the last several years has been just growth in fiscal spending, growth in government, et cetera. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier that one of my biggest concerns is the mounting debt, $20 trillion in debt. That has a huge price tag on it, and it's got enormous ramifications for any type of administration to try to overcome. The problem that I find is that nobody's really spent a lot of time talking about it. We're talking about too many other issues that we're trying to get out of the way first, but this is a looming issue that's going to take more than just 3 or 4 years to try to overcome.
So it's good. Bottom line is that fiscal spending we know will help the country, help the economy, but you're concerned about the balance between that and, of course, the national debt. So let's move across the country now. Let's go to the center. Mark, your thoughts from Kansas City.
I think the fiscal spending, just like Mike, I think we need to address that issue. I think it needs to come down. It has helped the economy, but at the end of the day, the economy's got to kind of help itself. So I definitely think it's an issue that's got to be addressed. He has addressed a lot of issues since he's been in. One of the things I've really respected him for is he doesn't want the government's involvement in the market. We've seen that with some of the actions that he's taken. But I agree with Mike on the fiscal spending. It's got to be addressed.
Okay. So going to you, Anthony, national debt. The national debt, generally speaking, is not a good thing. You just hope that Trump could spend money perhaps in a more productive way than President Obama did. It's kind of like, the difference between, borrowing money on your credit card to buy a television versus borrowing money to buy a business, what could be an appreciating asset. So your thoughts of the positives and negatives of the fiscal spending, Anthony?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a great analogy. It's almost like financing a vacation. And I really think that the only reason this economy and the stock market is at record highs right now is because we have borrowed our way to a good economy. It's almost like the government has been giving the economy $85 billion a month after month after month after month, and said, hey, here, go spend it. And of course, that money's been getting spent. The corporate profits have been going up. And we've created a lot of debt. And I think that if it wasn't for that fiscal spending, we would have had a major market meltdown at this point. So on one hand, I think it's done its job over the last 7 or 8 years that we've been doing quantitative easing. On the other hand, you can't borrow forever. It's time to curtail it back and actually put policy into place that's going to reduce the debt. And that's going to be a big step back before we can start moving forward.
So, Michael, I know you're worried about the national debt in terms of what happens when some of our bonds, our government bonds, mature and we have to refinance that debt. Might that be at a higher interest rate? Tell us about your concerns there.
Well, I mean, it's a very simple mathematical equation. Right now, interest rates are incredibly low. So maybe it doesn't cost very much at all to service the debt that we have. I mean, $20 trillion is an enormous number. I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. So you bump interest rates up to 1%, 2%, 3%. My gosh, you've just more than tripled the cost of servicing that debt. And in a very short order, then just the interest on servicing the debt is going to be the #1 line item in our budget. So it's a fantastic issue that needs to be quelled pretty quick. And there's not a real there's not a painless solution to it, as Anthony mentioned earlier. I mean, it's one of those things that it's going to take some bumps, it's going to take some bruises, but we also have to recognize this is the greatest country on God's green earth, and we have the ability to establish, put things in place that will allow us to move forward. It's just not going to be an easy task, no matter what.
Sure. Now, Mark, you mentioned deregulation. And of course, during the Clinton administration, they repealed two important parts of Glass-Steagall, which allowed, which basically took down the wall between commercial banks and being able to trade for their own accounts. And that wall came back up. Deregulation, the markets clearly like it. In fact, that's probably part of the reason Trump's been doing so well. The market's been doing so well ever since the election. But the other side of the coin is, can we go too far? What if we deregulate, we go back to where we were before Dodd-Frank? Can we have another financial crisis?
Well, yeah, I absolutely think we can have another financial crisis. And here's the issue. The government has been involved in this really since 2008. It's kind of like if you get a sickness and they give you a steroid shot. You feel a lot better, but at the end of the day, you still got the sickness. And the problem is we've been perpetuating this thing further and further. And I think the market really has to go through a sort of kind of healthy correction. And I think we got a correction in store.
So you're saying we have a governmental prescription for prednisone, if I read you correctly. So I'm going to ask you guys to stick around through the commercial break. We'll talk more when we return. We'll be right back. If you're not using someone who's well-trained in fixed income and you're born before 1966, it may just be time for you to break up with that advisor and move on. I would suggest someone who will care for you through these important years of your life. If you need help finding someone, call or write us. I'd also like to remind you of the special report entitled The Income Generation. This is available free to you, our loyal viewers, online. If you haven't downloaded your report, pick it up after the show. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation. Again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. Welcome back to The Income Generation. I'm David Scranton. Now let's bring back our financial advisor roundtable. We have Mark Falter, Michael Eastham, and Anthony Siccaro. And most importantly, we have breaking news that just occurred during the commercial break. What's that breaking news, you wonder? Well, Anthony Siccaro from the left coast just told me in confidence that he's committing to lose 60 pounds, that's 60, by the end of 2017. So Anthony, there it is on national television. Now you have millions of people that are going to be holding you accountable. But more importantly, first of all, what do you think about Donald Trump? What do you think about deregulation? Do you think he'll go too far where we're risking having another 2008 financial crisis? Or do you think he's going to find that comfortable line in the middle?
I think if there was more deregulation, maybe it would have kept you announcing my goal on national TV. So I thank you very much for that. But the bottom line is I agree that you want to let businesses do what they got to do, but I also agree that there's got to be some level of regulation. You can't just let everyone run wild. You can't let the banks invest in everything they want. I do believe that Dodd-Frank had a lot of good attributes to it. I also believe it was a little strong in some areas. So I'm really hoping that he doesn't just repeal the whole thing. I'm hoping he kind of takes the good and leaves it and takes out the fat that that maybe is really crimping the economic growth and kind of gets the best of both worlds. So
sure. Michael, it was funny. He was on television just about a week and a half ago. We was talking to all the top executives from Big Pharma. And he said to them, and I thought this was perfect, a perfect way to say it, but he says, you guys are having a tough time getting permits to establish your factories to make your drugs here in the United States. And you're having a tough time getting some of your new drugs through the FDA and getting your approvals. But beside that, everything's going well. And of course, he got laughter from the group of Big Pharma executives. Your thoughts about that fine line between deregulation, but yet not letting a 2008 occur again?
I think there's ultimately there needs to be there is a role for accountability. And yes, I believe in free markets. I think that's the best way to get the economy going. But at the same time, there has to be a certain level of accountability, especially in industries that affect millions of Americans. So whether you're talking about pharmaceuticals or you're talking about manufacturing or just any type of area where there could be some sort of negative implication, medical industry overall, there has to be some sort of a ground floor accountability line. And that to me is the fine line. You don't want to over-regulate because it puts handcuffs on entrepreneurship and free markets. But I think the wild, wild west is not the way to solve it either.
Yeah, good comments, good thoughts. Thank you. It's amazing, how divisive this election was, and even today. Just a couple nights ago, I was having dinner or having a conversation with somebody who literally truly believes that the world's going to come to an end because Donald Trump is president. It's absolutely crazy. So anyway, gentlemen, stick around. We'll be right back. And we're going to have some fun because we come back, we're actually going to play a game. So stay with us. We'll be right back after the commercial break. This is fun. This is great. 3, 2, 1. But I'd like to take a few seconds and tell you why I decided to write the book entitled Return on Principle. Basically, it all boils down to this. Let's face it, you deserve to live a happy retirement. It's as simple as that. But for many, the subject of money, finance, and math is complicated. Here's a fun fact. Many Americans claim that they'd much rather clean a toilet than calculate a tip in a restaurant. Thank you, I guess. But it doesn't have to be that complicated. Using the 7 core values I outline in my book, you too will be able to build a life based upon the right core principles. Cut. Return on Principle isn't just a book about financial investing, it's about investing in your life. I know for a fact that you're going to love it. Okay, now it's just getting a little weird here. Welcome back to The Income Generation. I'm David Scranton. Now, let's bring back our panel. Joining us, we have Michael Eastham, Anthony Siccaro, and Mark Falter. Gentlemen, I was talking right before the break about 3 evenings ago. I had dinner with a good friend of mine who kind of surprised me. His political beliefs are a little different from mine. He was basically taking on the role of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin all put together. In fact, my text messages over the last 3 days have been referring to him constantly as Karl with a K and Vladimir. So let's go right to the center of the country. Mark, I'm confident that you're going to have a different review from my good friend Karl Marx. And bottom line is that, if he's right, though, and Trump is that bad for the economy, we have a 2008 all over again in the stock market. Question is, how are you going to manage your clients' expectations when they lose 50% again?
Well, I'll tell you, you're asking the question, can we have another 2008 or can we have a 50% dip? There's some economists, as you well know, that are calling for a dip larger than that. And I am expecting that dip.
Now, back to the East Coast. Michael, how would you answer that question with your clients?
Well, I'd make the comment, keep calm and keep trucking on. As Mark said a minute ago, the majority of our clients are invested for income. If they need the income, their paychecks don't change. They continue to get those even if the market goes down. If they don't need the income, well, it's a buying opportunity, and we're increasing their income by buying more shares.
You guys, this doesn't make it for good TV here when everybody's agreeing. Anthony, pull us out, save the show. Let's have some conflict here. How are you going to tell your clients to manage their expectations? What are you telling them when they lose 50%?
Well, if I was a stockbroker, I would tell them, guess what? Hang in, the market could come back. This is just the way it goes. But the reality is I'm not a stockbroker. And what I tell my clients is in 2008, none of my clients lost money. Why? Because we have them invested to be able to get enough eggs.
Oh, you guys. Oh, my goodness, I can't believe it. All right, well, I guess I've got to create some conflict myself somehow, some way, but it's not going to be this week on the show. Michael, Anthony, Mark, I really appreciate you guys joining me today. We're living in uncertain times, there's no doubt about it. And I believe it's a crucial time to stay informed and educated about how to protect your financial future. Thanks for watching. I'm David Scranton. This is The Income Generation.